Have you ever argued about whether Aliens is a horror movie? I know I have, and I don't think there's a definitive answer, but I'm curious to hear what you think. What differentiates a thriller from a horror? It's a question with no simple answer. Both can involve death, the supernatural, and both have scares and jump scares. Some have pointed out that horror typically speaks not only to death but damnation. In some cases I can see that, but if that's the dividing line, does that mean Jaws isn't a horror movie? Horror is certainly subjective, but are there specific factors that define and differentiate it from other genres? As a horror writer, I'd like to know, so I went looking for answers in the published literature. A recent paper by 𝗥𝗲𝗍 and 𝗥𝗲𝗱 attempted to quantify this by focusing on what they believe to be a critical element of the genre: protagonist vulnerability. The authors suggest that fear induced by horror stories comes from base fears about avoidance of threats and predation, and they suggest that there are two story signals that are critical in understanding those fears: the antagonist threat level and the protagonist's ability to evade that threat. In their paper they aim to test two hypotheses about horror movies. First, that horror narratives are more likely than non-horror narratives to feature vulnerable protagonists who possess low relative formidability compared to their antagonists. Second, that films with more vulnerable protagonists will be more frightening. To test the hypotheses, they identified four key variables to support their analysis. They defined the protagonist, P, and antagonist, A, levels of formidability, defined as functions of both offensive and defensive capacities, and also their level of persistence. They also assessed the presence and prominence of threats in movies. Films with a highly formidable antagonist may not be scary if the threat is rarely encountered, whereas a constant looming threat can amplify fear even if the antagonist is not overwhelmingly powerful. They therefore defined a threat presence, or T variable, to measure the extent to which the antagonist or their influence is felt throughout the story. Finally, their last variable was environmental hostility, or E, which is the danger level posed by the environment or context, as some inherently decrease the likelihood of survival. They further postulated a relationship between these four variables, which they called Protagonist Vulnerability Index, or PVI, which is dependent on the relative formidability of the protagonist to the antagonist. They further stated that this relationship was empirically derived from the data and that other formulas show very similar behaviors. To test the first hypothesis, 691 movies from across many genres were identified and scored using PVI, which they hope would help differentiate horror movies from other genres of film. Films classified as horror in combination with other genres: thriller, action, fantasy, and romance. Pairwise analysis found that horror films had statistically significant higher PVI values than all other categories, with the sole exception of a comparison between horror and hybrid horror, which was not significantly different. They retested the data using a simplified PVI dependent only on the A/P ratio and found the same results. Thus, knowing how dominant or vulnerable the protagonist is relative to the antagonist is sufficiently predictive of whether a film is a horror or not. To test the second hypothesis, the authors examined IMDb keywords for each of the films in the dataset, specifically to identify those which were not classified as horror, but were classified using the keyword fear. The films were divided into those tagged with fear and those that were not. Simple analysis shows that statistically significant differences existed between these two groups. This suggests PVI is a way to not only differentiate genre, but it also tracks the presence of fear-evoking content. The study suggests that horror films are distinct because they feature weaker protagonists, stronger antagonists, more persistent threats, and more hostile environments than other genres. Their analysis also suggests PVI as a potential predictor of fear response in viewers. They further speculate that PVI tracks relative danger, and when it exceeds a certain point, it triggers a primal fear response in the audience, although this was actually not tested in the paper. So what does this mean for creators? As a trained physicist, I love it when we can model complex phenomena using simple variables, but I'm also aware that most of the time such reductive analysis misses the nuance of a given problem. With the above caveat in mind, my takeaway is that these four variables are interesting elements to consider when crafting a horror narrative. By tweaking elements of a story to maximize PVI, this can potentially stimulate a critical fear response in the audience and therefore make the narrative more scary. So does this suffice to help us differentiate horror and non-horror films? I suspect not. As the audience section of their paper shows, PVI can impact different personality types in different ways, and thus perception of what constitutes horror or not is still a function of the individual. But the framework presented here does offer interesting structures for creators to play with as they craft their stories. Finding the right balance between the A, P, T, and E variables can go a long way to trigger a fear response, and that could be the difference between a satisfying horror story and a less satisfying thriller. Whether this framework is applicable beyond movies to support creators in other formats is also an interesting, but unfortunately unresolved question.